Hello, Rufus King Nation. This is Anthony Lauer, art and design teacher at Rufus King High School, and you're listening to episode 13 of the King's Cast, a podcast introducing our listeners to the men and women working each day to teach the next generation of Rufus King Generals. Today, we're talking about science with Keith Zeise, one of Rufus King High School's dedicated science teachers and coach. In our conversation, we will also discuss how the International Baccalaureate Program aims to develop King students into inquiring, knowledgeable, and caring individuals who strive to create a better and more peaceful world. Thanks for taking a few minutes to listen today. Good morning, Mr. Zeise. How are you?
Good morning, Mr. Lauer. I am well.
Wonderful. I hope you're enjoying this snowmageddon that is nothing as of yet.
It's always good to over-prepare than under-prepare.
It is. It definitely is. But it's not too bad outside. And even though we were able to work from home, we can enjoy a nice quiet school day to get some work done.
I need that.
As mentioned, Mr. Zeise is a science teacher here at Rufus King, but he also coaches a couple of our athletic and academic teams. I think that's most of the introduction I have there, so we can dive right into number one, unless I missed something to describe you.
Nope, that sounds great.
All right, so what brought you to Rufus King High School, or what was your route to being a teacher?
So I originally thought I was going to go to college to become a forester. I was going to go to UW-Stevens Point, but then I kind of realized I don't like the outdoors as much as I thought I did. So then
pesky mosquitoes.
Right, and deer flies. And then basically I tried to become a physical therapist. Then I realized I was not as interested in the human body as I thought I was.
Kinesiology.
But I did love science, so I thought, okay, I can go into teaching, even though at that time I was kind of afraid of other people. I was a very opposite type of person that I am now.
I was going to say, forestry definitely could have been a loner kind of aspect, but physical therapy, definitely a one-on-one.
Right.
But although very different than a classroom full of 40 students.
Yeah, absolutely. So I picked the major of, going with a biology teacher was my plan. And with that, you pretty much have to major in biology. And I minored in chemistry, so I would be, as my advisor said, more marketable. Even though I hated chemistry, which is odd because that's all I've ever taught here at King now.
I was going to say that's one of the few sciences that I could get behind just because it was more structured. I mean, it's all structured, but it reminded me a little bit more of math. It had the formulas that allowed me to kind of make sense of it.
Yes. So actually, I was on the 6-year plan in college. I was an athlete on scholarship, so I ran while I was taking my courses. And I wanted to be out in 5, but I needed to take a 6th year because I was still competing in my 5th year because of a red shirt. So I ended up taking even more courses, got more science in, and the NCAA paid for it. So I was okay with that 6th year. So the 6th year was all for student teaching. Then I interviewed at 2 places, Wisconsin Conservatory of Lifelong Learning and Rufus King. And I was actually offered the job at WCLL, and I interviewed with them first, and then I interviewed with King, and they put their request for me in 30 minutes after the interview. So I thought, wow, man, I must just be an all-star. I got both places want me so much. Well, then turns out the reason I was actually sent to King is because they put their paperwork in to request me 30 minutes before WCLL did. And then it was about 3 years later I found out that I wasn't so great at the interview. I was just the only candidate, and they needed somebody fast. So
Ouch.
I don't think I've ever really formally beaten out another person for a job in my life officially.
Wow. Only because you've been here for most of your career.
Right. I started in 99 right out of college, and I've been here now. This is my 24th year. So, yeah, that was the interesting thing that happened. I was kind of upset that...
Who decided to break that news to you, if I can ask? I mean, that's one of those things that you hope to never find out, but then when you do, I mean, who sits you down and goes, oh, yeah, you were just the best we had at the time?
I think it was probably 3 years in. We had a really great a dedicated teacher who was on the interview team, Mr. Glassnap, and in casual conversation, like my third year in,
drops that bomb.
I just thought, hey, how many people did interview when I interviewed it with you? And he said, you.
Well, I suppose, was it for like chemistry, or was it for science in general? Because that's the kind of thing that your department tends to specialize, whereas an English teacher isn't going to come in and say, oh, I'm just world lit, right? They don't come in with more of a specification, whereas, biology, chemistry, physics, earth science, if that's still what it's called, that's what it was called when I was in high school. Those I have specialties, and so granted, your licensure might be cross-categorical, I'm not certain. Excuse me, but they're probably looking for a specific area in science, whereas with the arts, they certainly aren't. You teach art, okay. Oh, yeah, we need to fill a chemistry or a clay role, you're fine. But for science, they might be more of a niche, so it might have been a smaller field because there weren't that many people going for chemistry that time around.
And I guess King so we had a gentleman, Mr. Dobeck, who moved from teaching chem to guidance, actually.
Okay.
So that was kind of a late decision, and then we had a bio teacher leave to become an assistant principal, I think, at Tosa West. So now they needed bio and chem.
And you were the perfect fit there.
Right.
There could have been other candidates. They just didn't have a dual, not licensure, but dual experience. That's one of the things I like about this interview is it gives all the listeners the opportunity, as well as myself, to learn my coworkers a little bit more. Brenda yesterday mentioned that when she got hired, she was half social studies, half guidance.
Yep.
And now she's the director of our counseling program. But I didn't know she was a social studies teacher. I didn't know Gatewood was in a band. I didn't know that Josh Joseph did security. I like this question because it humanizes us and allows our listeners to know where we came from and how life can be a wandering path sometimes.
Yeah, and up until probably 10 days before I started at King, I was under the assumption I was teaching biology and what was called integrated science back then. And then 10 days before, they told me I'm going to be teaching chemistry and integrated science. And I got so nervous because in student teaching, I was not good at teaching chemistry. And I thought I only did that to be marketable and get the job. And then, so it's ironic. I was so determined that I was going to be teaching bio and I was going to be the greatest bio teacher ever, and then I've never taught it officially. I did it only in student teaching. So,
wow.
But then I fell in love with chem because I was really good at, like, maybe as you said earlier, like the formulas and the logic of chemistry. I was good at following along, but if somebody were to ask, like, what did you just calculate? I would say the answer. Like I wouldn't be able to really explain, like, the amount of time a molecule spends in a gas chromatograph is determining its polarity and its overall mass. I wouldn't be able to explain any of that. I would just be able to run through the formula and use all the different things from a data booklet that I could get and get an answer. But I wouldn't. And
at that point, though, that's sometimes for a starting point, especially for students, what's important. Understanding that there is a formula, there is science that has existed that we can not fall back on, but use as a structure to move forward to answer some of those unknowns. We can use what has been established or theorized in the past to build up to answering some of the more unknowns and problem solving towards the future.
Yes.
Well, excellent. I took a similar role. I specialized in graphic design and digital art, and my first job for the first 8 years of my career was clay and sculpture.
Huh.
Sometimes you just take what you get.
And
but then we grow into it.
Where was that?
Oak Creek High School. I worked in Oak Creek for my first 8 years where I met my wife. And then after Act 10, I jumped over to MPS, and I haven't looked back.
Very good.
So how do you incorporate IB into your content area, and what is one aspect of the IB that you really connect with?
So the interesting part about IB is it's something that takes multiple years to really understand, and I was very grateful that I got to go to an IB conference at the end of my second year of being asked to teach IB chemistry. So I had all these questions that I would not have had had I had no experience trying to teach it.
I haven't looked at it that way. I didn't get to go until my fourth year here, and that's such a true statement, though. We wouldn't have had the questions to ask if we would have gone right away.
Right. It's just like, reading a manual on how to put something together. You can study it, memorize it, but until you actually get to work with pieces in your hand, you're not necessarily sure how this is going to be put together. Mm-hmm. So I was thankful for that. And the thing that really stood out was like how process-oriented IB chemistry is, as opposed to AP, which is much more factual. Here's these nuggets, here's these nuggets, here's these nuggets, calculate this, calculate that. It's like a laundry list of things that they want students to be able to do. It's a multiple choice test, and it's done. Whereas in the IB test, it's almost all short answer, and they use command terms like deduce and explain and analyze. And each command term is given a definition that we can go over with the students so they know exactly what the difference between explain and deduce is. And the thing that I fell in love with is the how and why of all the things we do. Because I alluded to earlier, like when I was in college, I just did the work, paid very close attention. I could reproduce what was being done. But I didn't really have an understanding, and I don't think I would have been a very good chemistry employee because I really didn't extend out as to like what does this really lead up to. So the IB does a great job of like asking questions that integrate multiple concepts into one question so that the students can not only understand the how and why, but also the how would I want to say this? The logical flow and the application to the real world. And I feel like when you do the laundry list, that makes it much, much harder to tie things to the real world, because if you're only covering one concept at a time, you're not really seeing how they link together to come up with one idea that you might see in your kitchen when you're cooking.
Or be able to connect with those other aspects that come down the line from that process or are similar in other areas.
Yeah, you're getting individual algorithms to solve each type of problem.
But it's so isolated in that education process in AP that you don't see the bigger picture.
Right.
Yeah, I think the command terms is one of those great aspects of IB that I know I don't do enough in my area. Not that I teach a DP class, I teach MYP, but I can still be introducing those. But that is a big difference between the idea of AP and IB. And I know, one of our goals with this podcast is to connect with our parents and students to kind of give them a better understanding, is we don't have a flow of IB in this district. There are some elementary schools doing PYP. There are some middle schools doing MYP, but the majority of the students that come to King are coming from non-IB schools because there are not enough middle and elementary offered. So they're not growing into that culture, but that's a big part of the differences between AP, which is the Advanced Placement American system from the College Board, to help our students become very academically minded, and IB, which is more of a pedagogical system to guide students through. And long story short, or long-winded answer coming to an end, since we don't get students coming in with a better understanding of the IB, using those command terms is a way to elevate their understandings based on another structure. Again, it's using vocabulary, but in a different way. These are vocabulary words that apply in all 8 of the content areas versus just for science. It is a mathematical formula, if I'm going to use this analogy as a stretch, that here we say deduce, and when you see deduce, you now need to remember what we taught you was deduce. You can deduce and come to a conclusion in science. You can deduce and come to a conclusion in math. You can do it in English. You can do it in social studies. Why did World War II happen? Can you deduce that answer versus can you explain that answer versus can you hypothesize a different answer? And I think those command terms really help the students, and I'm glad to hear that they're in your classes, because I know I've worked in the marketing aspect to make sure we have the command terms around the school, on the TVs in the cafeteria, just so that our juniors and seniors are seeing them as a touch point outside of each of their individual classes. Yeah, that was a long-winded answer.
Yeah, absolutely. The AP has actually slowly tried to morph itself more into an IB model. So they've dropped the all multiple choice. They still have it, but they're actually incorporating the internal assessment, the lab stuff that we do in IB, and they've added that to their test too. So they've actually come over to the light side a little bit more from that. So I think honestly, IB. I would give a lot of credit to IB to have. They didn't force it, but I think they understood how much more these kids really could understand the science as opposed to just, listing it or memorizing it.
Yeah. Same thing in the art world. I was trained in my last position as AP 3D teacher, and I got to go to that training. And then I've said it on the show before, I drank the Kool-Aid once I got my IB training and really understood this grander schema that helps to build up our students. And AP is getting there. Slowly but surely, they've altered the art curriculum as well. But I think IB, has been working on it longer. Simple enough. They've been working on it, I think, for 40, 50 years. And I don't know if College Board has had AP that long.
Yeah, I think it was, in mid-'70s it started?
Yeah, at least I know that we became, Rufus King became IB in the 70s is what I remember Gatewood telling me.
And I think
College Board was the late 80s, early 90s, but don't quote me out there, listeners.
Yeah, I think we're number 119 in the world. We were the
119th school worldwide to become IB.
And that's pretty cool.
It is. All those facts, I actually didn't have Gatewood jump into that when I had him on the show. Question number 3. In your classes, do you have a favorite unit, topic, or project that you teach?
So I do a couple different things that I've kind of, I feel I've created from nothing. Usually, as teachers, we try not to reinvent the wheel because there's so many great, innovative colleagues and coworkers and people across the country we have. But there was one I do with I call it a musical periodic table, and I do it for my sophomore intro chem kids, and it's 22 songs I play, and I have the kids listen. I usually dance and, try to act a fool a bit for 20 to 30 seconds while they write down characteristics of the song. And at the end of the 22 songs, they try to put the songs into different groupings that I carefully
curated.
Yeah, it's not all random. It's for a very important reason. And what it does is it illustrates the concept of periodicity, which is just like a periodical. It comes, there's a period of time, and then we have this magazine or we have this newspaper or whatever it is, and then in another week or a day or a month, you get another when it's all the same structure. So that's how the periodic table actually works. It's each row is a period, and it all has elements with similar characteristics that change as you move across. And then when you get to another row, you're going to see those same characteristics with the elements in the row below them. So the kids hopefully will learn that through these songs in my musical periodic table, that the order that the songs were played was arguably more important than the grouping that they decided to put with them. And if they understand that, sometimes when I'm on the 16th or 17th song, I ask students if they can predict what type of song I'm going to play next. And oftentimes I have several students who will spit out answers, and that's a pretty cool thing because that's really the whole idea, is not to turn in what they do at the end. It's just as we're going through it, are you understanding?
Can they predict it?
Are you understanding? You're taking evidence, you're processing it, and now you're making a prediction, which is exactly what IB Chem is meant to be about.
No, that's an awesome project. It's a cross-unit, I forget what they're called when we're supposed to be, I should know that answer. We're supposed to have different content areas, unit planners that are cross-curricular. But one of the side questions I wanted to ask for my own edification is, who designed the periodic table as a graphic organizer? Because I know one of the things I like to stress with my students, my Art Foundations class, is that what we work with, the color wheel, was invented by Sir Isaac Newton. When light and the spectrum were starting to become more visible, no pun intended, Sir Isaac Newton organized the first color wheel, not necessarily the modern color wheel, but that color theory started there in science with Sir Isaac Newton. But it is a graphic organizer. Kids look at it, they see a pretty poster, they see colorful wheel. They think about their Apple computer when it pauses and the little
And they
spinny
can
wheel goes.
see the
But they don't
complementary.
understand that it's that same graphic organizer that they teach you in English or social studies or science to organize information in a logistic way that makes sense. And the periodic table, as you just mentioned, is done that way. Who invented that particular visual graphic organizing?
So there was a Russian guy,
Sorry to put you on
late
the spot.
1800s, no problem. His name was Dmitry Mendeleev. An interesting component of Dmitry's life, brilliant chemist, but he actually, at the time, he was one of few chemists that were highly regarded that didn't buy into the concept of atoms. He buy into the concept of elements, but he wasn't convinced that they were these very, very tiny independent units. He
that
thought
would make those up.
Yeah, I thought elements were more of like a pudding type thing, as opposed to like individual beads kind of thing. So he's credited with the periodic table and the modern periodic table designing it, but it's very interesting that he didn't buy into the idea of atoms. But elements and atoms, I mean, elements are one thing, and you don't really have to believe in atoms. I shouldn't say believe. I hate using that in science. There really is no belief in science. You don't have to recognize that there are atoms to understand the concept of elements. So he put it together, and just like I had mentioned with, students being able to predict what type of song is going to be next, he actually was able to, when he discovered the periodicity of these elements, because he arranged them from lightest to heaviest, and what he ended up discovering is that the elements that were coming down the pike that he was doing this, like, they didn't fit in the pattern. So he left some spots on his first table blank with a question mark. And then later, posthumously, he was really credited with, okay, this is the element now we've found. This is the one he predicted, and this is exactly where it should be.
Going back to the semantics of belief versus recognize, I think is what you countered that with. That's one of those things that always blows my mind as we have advanced as a civilization, as beings, human beings, that we've discovered different things. And speaking specifically to science versus religion, because people use belief a lot more with religion, to have seen that grand design would have blown anyone's mind at that time, right? He started questioning, inquiring, analyzing what was going on. He found a way to organize that. We as a species developed our brains enough that we could start to find these things. And he went so far as to be able to find a structure, but to see that there is a grand design, that science has this mostly logical system of how things work. Like, that is recognized, but it blows belief out of the water at that moment. But it would have blown my mind to have seen something we didn't know at that time, right? We think we see everything in our day and age. We have access to everything on the phone. We can see, I think this morning I saw in the news that somewhere in South America, high schoolers were graduating and celebrating their graduation in their gym, and a sinkhole formed under the gym.
Oh,
and
my.
like 17 kids all fell into a sinkhole. And of course there's viral footage of somebody at the party watching that, right? Nobody's hurt as far as I know, but like, we can see everything right now if we choose to, especially in a first world country. But back then, to have been able to find a pattern, to find something that can easily be tested and repeatable, to then be able to discover and organize the periodic table, and to have those gaps, and to be comfortable knowing that we just haven't found it yet, like, that's, I don't know, that blows my mind.
Well, and he did get an element posthumously named after. There's actually only one person that had an element named after them while they were still alive. Carl Seaborg, they named Seaborgium after him as when he was still alive. So everybody else was posthumously honored with it. So he has a Mendeleevium on the periodic table.
Well, it's a great way to remember who made it then.
And he looks I have a poster in my room. He looks very, very Russian.
Yeah, that can be a very cliche thing, but yeah, there was definitely, yeah. Very cool. Moving on, for parents and students out there, what advice do you have for them about being a successful student or about being successful at Rufus King?
So I think it boils down to being a successful student is about, good habits. We had unbelievably awesome educator retire a little while back, Mr. Steve Wagner. And he would just drill his students with, like, this is how long it takes, between 43 and 66 days to develop a habit. And habits can be good or bad. And then they're very tough to break if you can make it through the 43 to 66 days on average. Now you're into the habit. And if it's a good habit, you're going to have it for a while. It's going to be just as hard to kick as a bad habit. So I learned at an early age that I needed to keep myself at least somewhat organized. So I bought a folder for each class starting in first grade that I had, and I had a notebook for each class. And I made sure that I put only work from each class into a folder for that class, and then write stuff in a notebook that meant notes for only that class. I'm not a very organized person, but I think somehow I recognized that that was very important. And since I was in that habit, I always made sure I had something in my notebook, and I always had something in my folder. So I could stay organized, which then forced me to stay on top of the material. So I made myself, I was very uncomfortable if I didn't put something in my notebook. So it made me stay consistent day to day. And I try so hard to get students to do that. And for many, I can't seem to get them to buy in to just bring a folder and a notebook every day, and things are going, I'm not saying it's going to be magic, but things will get better for you because you will hold yourself accountable. And I think that allowed me to be a successful student and get through college and all that kind of stuff.
This episode, I feel like I'm bringing a lot of things back to me, and I apologize for that. But on that note, I just started this year, since we're in my classroom, having sketchbooks with each class on it.
Ooh, wow.
As I worked with Graph a couple years ago to rewrite our middle tier classes, to fill the voids where the kids are getting into our IB program and not necessarily being as successful as they should be, we restructured the classes to get there. Long story short, again, I decided, I found a local company, sent me a flyer, and they're like, hey, we make custom sketchbooks here in America. I was like, you know what? They're like $1.06 more than what I could get in the catalog. And so I started now each kid this semester got a notebook. So when they get to junior, senior year, if they choose to, they have each class that they can go back and reference.
That's fantastic.
That's just on that organization note. I fell in love with it. I just ordered another set for next semester, hoping that they got out and are getting printed, and will be here by January 3rd when we start again, so I can start the semester for the first time with them and have the kids stay organized. Like, that is great advice, and one that I just now, after 18 years, decided was worthy of being in my classroom.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, and just an interesting story. So I'm very serious about notes, or I try to be with students. Not all my students are very serious back with the notebooks, but I do collect them, and I try to hold that little carrot for them that's part of their grade. It's, as long as they're just writing down what I'm writing down. And you can, if you include your own, then you can have an advanced grade on that part. So,
well, again, I'm not sure. I am certain that your standards flow very similarly to mine, and for the design class and for art, but it's essentially the scientific method. Am I right?
Yeah.
Standard A is some kind of inquiry and analysis. Standard B is some kind of discovery, developing something, practice. Standard C is probably experimenting, and then D is evaluating, somewhere along those lines.
Yeah, reflecting on impacts in society kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's a good way of putting it. I think for some of the science classes, criterion A is like more suited towards the knowledge, like the facts-based part. Yeah.
Where I was going with that is that's where that note taking would then come in. That is a great way to have another area of an advanced or a proficient in your ability to take notes in the inquiry and analysis or the research segment of the standards.
Absolutely.
Can I ask, how have you, if at all, transitioned into the digital era with note taking? My high school art teacher took we get in a sketchbook assignment on Monday. We had to hand in the sketchbook by Friday. She would take boxes of sketchbooks home and grade them. And I started that 18 years ago, and it lasted 2 months. Hearing that you're doing something similar while we're also, transitioning out of COVID and Google Classroom, et cetera, are you doing any kind of digital note taking, or is everything still?
So my students are actually upset with me on that, because I don't post the notes we take in class on Google Classroom. I do everything on the smartboard. So I could, save stuff on a Jamboard and then share it with them. But I guess I'm kind of very old school in the idea that, whether this is backed with actual data or not, I've subscribed to the idea that writing something is like 5 times reading it.
There is a level of taking notes that it has been scientifically proven to help with memory recovery and data recovery. It's still valid.
And if you are actually physically writing, that's also forcing that habitual stuff. You're saying, okay, there might be not a lot of notes, because he talks a lot, but if I can commit myself to writing the notes as we go and then asking any questions myself by adding some notes of my own, I'm going to be successful. Unfortunately, a lot of kids just put it on Google Classroom.
Yeah, I want the easy way. I want it at my fingertips.
And I can look at it later. And then, we all know as humans, like, if you're not willing to do something now, the idea of putting it off till later is very, very unlikely.
Well, that's the old story, speaking of the storm coming as it's starting to snow now, of the grasshopper and the ant, right? Like, if you're not going to do it now, you're not going to do it later, and then you're going to be stuck in the cold.
Yep, absolutely. So, the notebook stuff is about consistency, and it's also about the reflecting part, like in criterion D. Like, are you able to look at a new question and then maybe go back into your actual notes, which if you write them physically, you're more likely to know when and where you wrote them. And if you write them physically, you're more likely to have your mind go back to that moment and understand what it might be. Whereas if I just give a packet of handouts with my notes, you've now not really attached anything personal to that particular concept.
No, and you haven't put in the work to even commit it to the memory, because you can just look at it and that's nothing.
But unfortunately, I think
it doesn't build the synapses in your brain to connect it with anything, just reading it once on a screen.
Yeah, but with the shortage of middle school science teachers we've had, unfortunately, we have a lot of, very well-meaning people who are teaching science, but it becomes more of the fact. And a lot of our kids are coming and they don't understand, like, why I'm taking so much time to explain. Like, they just give me what you want me to know, and then I'll put it on the test. And it's so hard to try to explain that that's not what science is. Science is exactly the opposite of facts, but that's what it's kind of become as a standard in our society. Is if you're smart in science, you just know things. You know why rainbows form. You know why weather patterns are the way they are. It's really tough once that's been entrenched in a student to get them to understand that that's actually not at all what science is.
No, and I experienced it, the MYP design class, those standards, that design cycle is the scientific method. And so I tried this year to compare that to my incoming freshmen right away in August. And a lot of them said, well, I don't know. I never did a science lab. I don't know what you're talking. What's a lab report? Like, I saw that firsthand here at King. And I understood that some of it was they weren't in the building if they were in MPS for 2 years of their middle school. But I got to hear what you're saying. They did not understand that it was a thing that you do. They didn't understand application and experimentation.
Right. And
that leads to discovery way more than memorization and facts.
And the idea that you don't know something is actually, in my opinion, more valuable if you know the process
of how to question it.
Because now you're going to ask questions. If you want to help to be the smartest person in the room, some people think you have to be the dumbest by asking a whole bunch of questions. But as teachers get older and older and students get older, they understand that the people asking questions are going to be the most intelligent, because they are asking questions for the deeper understanding, so that they can process it and understand the science behind it, whether it's a science class or not.
Yeah.
Science is just a label, but it's really in every single course you've ever taken. We as
human beings are hardwired to make connections and to look for patterns. Right. We had to figure out, if we understood that there was a footprint in the ground and there could be a predator. We had to understand what was going on with the weather, even if we didn't understand the science behind it, to know what season it was, what time of day it was. Our brains are wired to question and find patterns. And we lose that as we get older, and we find that we can find other sources for the answers without putting in the work.
Right, or we just become complacent with going straight to the answer.
I think that's a much better way of saying it, yeah.
Go straight to the answer and then miss out on the process, which is not as tangible, especially in a conversation or on a test, but
or in real life application.
Right. Makes all the difference in the world for making the world a better place and understanding. If you're willing to understand and take time through the process rather than skipping right to the result, you're going to be more open-minded, you're going to have more empathy, you're going to be a kinder person, and you're going to be way more understanding of behaviors, and hopefully not as angry and judgmental as what tends to be happening in the world now with so much.
Very well said.
So many answers out there, but not a lot of questions.
Yeah. No, it goes back to that old adage of travel and go into a culture that you don't understand. Put yourself in the shoes of the outsider, and you will have a better understanding of the similarities we all have, and you will forget about the differences.
Absolutely.
Same thing in these situations, in questioning an uncomfortable situation of not knowing the answer, not knowing why something works. Put yourself in that uncomfortable spot of not knowing and trying to understand instead of just giving up.
And then you become comfortable almost always then.
Yeah.
Because you are...
You've lived through it. It's not as scary.
Right. And you understand that sometimes being silent is more important than speaking. And sometimes...
It's something I desperately need to learn. Still at 40 years old.
Me too.
So, content-specific question here, Mr. Zeise, or more related to outside of your science content. You are also known as Coach Zeise. You are a beloved institution here at Rufus King High School in cross country and track. Could you talk a little bit about your role as a leader and mentor outside of the science lab?
So, cross country and track was a big part of my life. So when I decided I wanted to be a coach, it was going to be about trying to get as many students the experience that I had. And I went to Bayview High School, so I was an MPS grad, and I always appreciated my coaches, so I never really took them for granted, but I kind of thought that that's what schools had, is these fantastic individuals that I had as coaches for myself and my teammates. I thought that that was pretty much what every school had. And then when I went through college and then I came to King and I saw that that was not the case, I made it kind of a mission that, hey, I'm going to try to provide what they provided me to as many people as possible. And cross country and track was huge in terms of like my focus. You know, the old adage, if you want something done, ask a busy person. So the fact that I would do...
I have not heard that.
You have not?
I can relate, as I'm sure Mr. Xavier could, in some of the things that we've done around the school. That's wow. Yeah, I've never heard that one, but it's so true.
So, as long as I was staying busy, then I was being as productive as I could. And, running cross country and then track and field events, it's like all sports, it's exhausting. But you get to experience things with your teammates. You get to experience individual highs that I don't think come in all non-physical endeavors, but certainly they're very similar. They're just a little different. So I wanted to provide that for my athletes, and I wanted to also make sure that I never allowed myself to only be concerned with the top athletes. I wanted to make sure I was doing my best to give the same experience to all athletes, whether they were walking half of the distance in cross country or track, or whether they were, had some innate talent that was exciting to watch. So I made it my goal to say, I'm going to treat as best as I can all of these athletes the same. And what it's kind of morphed into is, I don't necessarily say I can treat all the athletes the same, but the athletes that really put in effort, not like the most unbelievable effort, but as long as they're putting in effort, they're coming to practice every day and they're trying to do the best they can. I honestly can say I focus on the lowest end athletes as much as I do the highest end, because that's the effort. And that's really, to me, what life is all about. Like, you may not have the abilities that other people have, but you still have the ability to experience what they experience. It might not be as extrinsically valuable because not as many people are going to recognize that, but all that ever matters in life is that you do. So the person who finishes 101st in a cross-country race can arguably feel much prouder of themselves and feel so great that it may dwarf the feelings of the athlete that finished first that really didn't put in their best effort because their talent is so much greater. So that's always been something that I treasured and I learned on my own with my help of my coaches, and that's what I wanted to bring to King. And he said, the more athletes that we can get involved in all sports, and we have wonderful Mr. Nichols who is constantly trying to get kids to do athletics, because it's just another way to allow life to kind of just factor in. Like, if you put in the work, you will get something out of it that's going to be valuable. It's not going to be the same for every person, but you will get something valuable. There was a now retired coach, legend and coach, Jim Carney at Marquette, who retired recently after almost 40 years of coaching cross country and track. He said, cross country is a sport where what you get out of it is in direct proportion to what you put into it. And if we can run programs that are with that as the number one goal, as opposed to, W's and L's, I think we not only will get way more W's than L's, but we'll be doing it the right way.
Yeah. Well said. I can see how your charisma feeds kids into the program and helps them stick with it for 4 years, as well as to make them better student athletes and to expand into other sports. As I learned personally, my nephew, got introduced to you, I think, at Freshman Bridge, and all of a sudden cross country became one of the biggest things in his life. That then inspired my son to do cross country for the first time in his life as well, and he hopes to come here and have the same experience at Rufus King as my nephew is. So I've always heard the legend, but now I have a personal connection, and I get to hear it from the horse's mouth.
Yeah, horses behind is usually where I'm referred to, but that's okay.
So we usually wrap up with some kind of closing thought, quote, or book recommendation. You've already given us quite a few good nuggets of thoughts and advice, but is there anything you want to end the show with? I missed a step in my evolution to be a teacher. I was thinking I might want to be a history teacher,
but I am not a great reader. I went to a place in, early grades of my life where it was called the Learning Center, which took me a little while to figure out was for students that were pulled out who were lower than the expected reading level.
Struggling, yeah.
So I can process things. It's a very, it's kind of a laboriously difficult
Tedious
process
thing.
for me, tedious. So I really do prefer watching, and I really enjoyed like lectures in college. I'd learn better and I connect with if it's coming from a human being as opposed to a book. And that's just differences that we all have. So I'm not judging myself or anybody else, but reading has been a difficult struggle for me. So I don't read that much. But I did read a book a while back called The Disappearing Spoon, which is basically a collection of stories about the elements on the periodic table, how they were discovered, how they were isolated, or how they were created, and then all the different human parts of the whole process. For instance, there's a man, Fritz Haber, was responsible for saving millions, if not billions, of lives with something called the Haber process, which would create more ammonia, which is the base chemical for making fertilizers and, unfortunately, explosives and things later. But he was actually a Jewish man who was a full Nazi, and he actually designed the chemical that was put into the gas chambers. So here you have a man who has given so much to the world
through his scientific discoveries,
but also was actively trying to take away and
that's
do
a dichotomy right there. I mean,
and it also talks about Alfred Nobel, and the reason he created the Nobel Peace Prize was because he was able to make nitroglycerin much more stable.
With DuPont, right? He worked with the DuPont company?
Yes. And he ended up creating basically dynamite that would be much safer for the miners, that wouldn't explode in the crates they were carrying down there just spontaneously. But then he was filled with guilt because
he made something so
destructive that he didn't even think would lead to weapons of mass destruction. And then when that happened, and that seemed to be all he could think about, not the other great that he had good that he had encouraged in society, in his guilt, he created the Nobel Peace Prize to try to encourage people to do science and life more peacefully. So there's a lot of very, very fun stories in that book, and I could tolerate that a lot more.
How the spoon disappeared?
So the disappearing spoon
the disappearing spoon.
The disappearing spoon, yeah. And that is just a nice catch title about chemists who used to play jokes on some of their friends and acquaintances, where they would take a spoon and they would mold it out of gallium instead of silver. Gallium is a metal that's just really notorious for having an extremely, extremely low melting point. So they would give them a spoon to put sugar into their tea, and as they stirred, it would melt into the bottom, and they would pull out the nub and be very concerned with what they were about to consume. Yeah. So
that's awesome. Did you see the trailer this week for Oppenheimer?
I have not, but I've read some small articles, and I'm very excited.
Yeah, it just speaking of the idea of Nobel and the history of what Oppenheimer did for the nuclear bomb and how he felt after the fact, just reminded me of that. But there's your connection to history right there, right? Like, everything has a history to it, including content areas like science and math and social studies, or social studies, of course, but even physical education and health. And those histories still play a part in where we came from and where we can move forward with. So you are still a history teacher, teaching the periodic table.
Just not reading a lot of words.
How it came about, yeah. Well, thank you so very much for taking time out of your day grading exams. I appreciate it, and I hope you have a good rest of your winter break. We will be going live in February with this, but we are recording before the holiday break. So have a good holiday and Happy New Year.
Thank you. You too, Mr. Lauer.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Hello, Rufus King Nation builders. I wanted to thank you for taking the time today to listen to our 13th King's Cast podcast, introducing our community to the staff working daily in the halls of Rufus King High School to support our student generals. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation with Keith Zeise, one of the teacher coaches here at Rufus King. After today's conversation with Keith, I can see the connection made between the classroom and our athletic program here at Rufus King, and how we as a school work hard to create student athletes. That said, please join us again next month as we sit down with another Rufus King staff member to discuss how they bring the International Baccalaureate to life in their classrooms.